talked about desperate faith versus deliberate faith, and how much time we actually spend in desperate faith, but how we're to walk in deliberate faith. This is where our obedience comes from, isn't it? Well, this morning we are preaching through the gospel chronologically, and sometimes you come to a story and you think, well, Father, what are you trying to teach me through this message? And sometimes it takes a few days to sink in. But this morning, Jamie started reading our passage, and it's pretty lengthy, so bear with me this morning. I'm going to read the whole passage to you. Our sermon title this morning is Jesus Rejected at Home. And when he came to the village of Nazareth, his boyhood home, he went as usual to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up and read the scriptures. The scroll of Isaiah, the prophet, was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, and that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." He rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes in the synagogue looked at him intently, and then he began to speak to them. "The scripture you have just heard has been fulfilled this very day." Everyone spoke well of him and was amazed by the gracious words that came out of his lips. "How can this be?" they asked. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" Then he said, "You will undoubtedly quote me this proverb, 'Physician, heal yourself,' meaning do miracles here in your hometown like those you did in Capernaum. But I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. And certainly there were many needy widows in Israel in Elijah's time. And when the heavens were closed off for 3.5 years and severe famine devastated the land, yet Elijah was not sent to any of them. He was instead sent to a foreigner, a widow of Zarephath in the land of Sidon. And many in Israel had leprosy in the time of Elijah, but the only one healed was Naaman, a Syrian. And when they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him and forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built. They intended to push him off the cliff, but he passed right through the crowd and went on his way. At some point in our lives, we've all have experienced the sting of rejection, haven't we? For me, I instantly flash back to those childhood memories. Do you remember standing on the playground? Maybe you weren't one of these kids, but you're the last kid always picked. You know, I wasn't always the last kid, but there was times I remember being the last kid picked. Remember how that made you feel? Or what about your first crush? You know, you remember the first girl or guy you really were goo-goo over, and then you realized they didn't feel the same way about you like you felt them? That was devastating, wasn't it? What about that first job interview or any job interview, especially when you have to go through multiple levels of interviews and you're getting all excited, "Hey, man, they've called me back for the third time," only to get, "I'm sorry, you're just not the right fit. We found someone more qualified." Rejection. It's terrible. What about rejection from a college? Or being stood up on your date? Or what about being stood up for prom? And a lot of us have felt the rejection of divorce. You know, some of these things are heartbreaking. Maybe even rejection because you're a Christian. Or maybe even rejection inside your family. The sad point is, living in this broken world, none of us will walk through this life without rejection of some kind. And this is what Jesus has done. Have you ever heard the old saying, "You can't get above your raisin"? Have you heard that? Well, this is exactly what Jesus is experiencing. The people of his hometown couldn't get past who Jesus was to see who he had become. Which leads us to our first point. The person. Who was Jesus to the people that were familiar with him? Well, some of the first things we see is, what do they say? Well, they know him as Joseph's son, right? Well, he's the oldest sibling of 7. Details. Listen to Mark 6:3. And then they scoffed. He's just the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And his sisters live right here among us. And they were deeply offended and refused to believe in him. Family, these people were familiar with Jesus. They knew who he was. They were familiar with his parents. They were familiar with his siblings. They watched him grow up. Some of them probably even helped with the raising part, right? They remember him running through the streets and playing with the other kids. They remember seeing him at church. They remember seeing him at the local celebrations. They remember him working beside his father Joseph day and night and becoming this wonderful carpenter. They saw him as a blue-collar tradesman, a carpenter. They knew his history. They knew that he came from a blended family, that Joseph was his stepfather, and that he had 6 brothers and sisters. Quite a family. We don't see Joseph mentioned in this passage, so we can only assume that Joseph has died. And like those assumptions, these folks knew Joseph's story, though, didn't they? They knew the story behind how Jesus became the patriarch of the family, the oldest son. But all we can do is assume they would have been aware of all these details in Jesus' life. They would have been aware that he stepped off into the ministry and the tension that would have been in the home from him leaving the home to go into his ministry. All these assumptions that we have to make about Jesus, these people knew. What's the one thing that we see that they did approve of? They thought he was pretty eloquent with his speech, right? They were pretty impressed with his ability to preach. They liked how he delivered the message. They just didn't like the message. Which leads me to my second point, the preaching. Verse 22 says, everyone spoke well of him and was amazed by his gracious words that came from his lips. How can this be, they asked. Isn't this Joseph's son? Have you ever been there? Have somebody, all of a sudden, somebody from your past comes up, says something or does something, goes, man, who is this guy? This is not the guy I remember. Well, I think we've all been there. But I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. The NLT translates verse 22 interpretively. It says, all spoke well of him. But that's not what Luke says, and this is important. Luke says literally that they testified, and this is important. The Greek word witness, martyarto, does not necessarily mean they approved, but they attest to him. And this is especially important since it's connected to amazed, which the Greek word is thamazo, which always falls short of genuine faith. So what we believe here, the bottom line is, these people were talking about Jesus, but they weren't committed to Jesus. They were impressed by his preaching, but infuriated by the message that he was bringing. So that explains how their testimony could go from favorable to hostility so quickly. And then Jesus reminds them of his famous proverb, physicians heal themselves. Jesus had apparently been doing miracles and performed many of them in Capernaum, and now the locals wanted the same kind of performance. It's pretty common, right, for a plumber to have leaky faucets in his house, and if you know a good mechanic, he's probably got more problems with his car than the average guy. Because why? They're very good at doing their profession somewhere else. And that's what Jesus is trying to say to the Jews here. Why was he not able to do all these miracles in his own hometown? Well, it was because of their own unbelief in who he was. Listen to Mark 6, 5 through 6. And because of their unbelief, he couldn't do any miracles among them except place his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Family, our faith is called a saving faith for a reason. It's because we have to believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and that he's going to do what he says he's going to do. Yes, we get this great free gift of salvation, but it's all faith-based. Do you understand that? That our faith is completely tied to the belief of Jesus Christ. If we don't believe in Jesus Christ, you are lost for all eternity. If you cannot grasp that Jesus Christ is who he says he is, we're lost. This is what's wrong with his own hometown. They couldn't grasp who this man was standing in front of them. Luke 4:28 through 29. And when they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him and forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built, and they intended to push him over the cliff. Jesus has just experienced every pastor's worst nightmare, right? His congregation just stormed the pulpit and carrying him out to what? To take him to dinner? No. They're taking him out to kill him. So when we say Jesus can relate to everybody in every situation, we can take that to the bank. I don't know of a situation where this has happened yet, but knowing this family, if it was ever going to happen, it could happen here. But what does this remind us of? This conversation kind of reminds us of the jeering mob while Christ was on the cross, right? I mean, we kind of hear this same kind of tone when the bystander said, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one. And so did the soldiers, right? They were picking on him. They were throwing out slander. And even the criminal on the cross was calling him, hey, save yourself if you can save yourself. But Jesus responds with his own statement, right? No prophet is welcome in his own country. But there's a truth in his parable that demonstrates something here, that the others were wrong. Because the statement you want to try to pull out of this, what they're saying is, hey, charity starts at home. But that's not what we see. Jesus was charitable. He offered them grace and charity, and it was refused time and time and time again. I want you to think about how many times Jesus was rejected by his own people. John 1:11 says, he came to his own people, and even they rejected him. And this sets up a pattern for Jesus' ministry. He didn't come for the healthy, did he? But he came for the sick, the outsider, the ostracized, the downtrodden. And time again, his family, his chosen people, rejected him and turned him away. Which brings us to our third point, the problem. What we see here is the people of Nazareth judging someone they were familiar with by their own standards and ideas. And if we really cut to the chase, the root problem, it was the lack of their own belief. They didn't believe Jesus was who he says he was. And family, we have the same problem. We're familiar with Jesus. We know who he is. We know what he's done. We know he's God's only son. But we struggle to trust him and believe. So just like the Jews, we continue to judge him by our own standards and ideas as well. something I find amazing. Christianity seems to be waning here in the States, and it's exploding in the Southern Hemisphere. We used to take surveys in the United States to see if you believed in God. Now we take surveys to see which God you believe in. Now, our slogan was one nation under God, and now you have to ask the question, which God? I think this nation has been so focused on religious freedom that in the process we've dethroned God and we are moving away from Him at a rapid pace. Family, when God is rejected, something or someone else has to be created, conjured to take His place. I need to repeat that. When God is rejected on a personal level, on a family level, or a national level, when God is rejected, something or someone else has to be contracted, developed to replace Him. Why else would people so quickly be chasing other religions and other gods and every other religion that comes ashore? Is because there's a void when you push God away that we naturally have to try to fill because God is absent. I find it amazing that every religion in this country is flourishing except for Christianity. And the only place it's thriving is in the Southern Hemisphere. Here's why. Just like Jews, most Christians really don't know Jesus. They're just familiar with Him. We don't give Him enough priority, so we don't spend enough time with Him to build that relationship that lets us trust who He is. We're not alone. Most evangelicals are right there with us. Right? We know His story. We know He came to die for us. We know He's God's only Son. We know He loves us. We're familiar with the story. We're familiar with Him. Well, familiarity is dangerous. Jesus is just not our buddy. He is our God. Let me read you something by David Wells. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a pretty good author. He's wrote a couple of books on theology, and he does a great job of pointing out the issue here. It is one of the defining marks of our time that God is now weightless. Weightless, not that He is airy, but that He is weightless, meaning He has become unimportant. He rests upon the world rest upon the world so inconsequently as not to be noticeable. So those who assure the pollsters of their belief in God's existence, listen to me, may nevertheless consider Him less interesting than television, His commands less authoritative than their appetites for affluence and influence, His judgment more awe-inspiring, no more awe-inspiring than the evening news, His truth less compelling than the advertiser's sweet fog of flattery and lies. This, he says, is weightlessness. And weightlessness, what a great way of describe what's going on around us. It is so true. We compartmentalize our faith. We put God in a box and we put Him on the back burner. We take Him out on Sundays or in a time of crisis. We come to church when we feel like it. We read our Bibles when it's convenient. What's crazy, it's our blessings that distract us. The blessings that were given by God. The blessings He gives us distracts us from building a relationship with him. How sad that is. Society's attitude in many evangelicals is Jesus is not enough. It breaks my heart. The Jesus I know is more than enough. And he's always been more than enough and always will be more than enough. But it's gotten this way because of Christians that are just familiar with Jesus. They are the majority inside of Christianity. And they're the majority that interacts with the world in the workplace, at the store, on the ball field. This is the witness that the world sees. They are lukewarm, weak Christians. There is no reflection of Jesus in them, and Jesus is their God of convenience. Family, we have to be more than familiar with Jesus. We have to know Jesus, and we have to trust him like the psalmist. Let me read a couple of Psalms to you this morning. 56:3. But when I'm afraid, I will put my trust in you. Psalms 118:8. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in people. Psalm 16:5-11. Lord, you alone are my inheritance, my cup of blessing. You guard all that is mine. The land you have given me is a pleasant land. What a wonderful inheritance. I will bless the Lord who guides me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I know the Lord is always with me. I will not be shaken, for he is right beside me. No wonder my heart is glad and I rejoice. My body rests in safety. For you will not leave my soul among the dead or allow my body to rot in the grave. You will show me the way of life, granting me the joy of your presence and the pleasure of living with you forever. Family, if we're going to know Jesus like this psalmist, we got to put in the work. Let me read Jeremiah 29:13. If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. Proverbs 2:3-6. Cry out for insight and ask for understanding. Search for them as you would for silver. Seek them out like hidden treasure. Then you will understand what it means to fear the Lord, and you will gain knowledge of God. For the Lord grants wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. Isaiah 55:6-7. Seek the Lord while you can find him. Call on him now while he is near. Let the wicked change their ways and banish the very thought of doing wrong. Let them turn to the Lord, that he may have mercy on them. Yes, turn to our God, for he will forgive generously. Ephesians 5:15-16. So be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Family, I think it boils down to this. If we truly, we all profess to know Jesus. But if we truly know Jesus, and are not just familiar with him, we'll feel like this psalmist. We will feel like he is our inheritance, that there's this anticipation of what's coming. We're going to feel joy when we start to think about him. We're going to want to be in his presence. We're going to crave the time that we have with him. And you will be diligent at seeking out who he is. Familiarity doesn't help you understand who Jesus is. if you know him, you will long for him. If you know him, he just won't be your God of convenience. He will be your all in all. Where do we start? You know, we think that Christianity is this giant mystery. We don't understand how disciples got from being guys that didn't have faith in Jesus, how they doubted everything about him, to where they were willing to be hung on a cross upside down because they didn't want to deserve the same death as Christ. These men were intimate with Jesus. They knew everything about him. Well, how did they do that? They spent 3 years with him, day in, day out, studying his every move, hinged on everything he said. Did they always grasp what he was saying? No. But yet they were seeking and yearning for everything that he would say. Guess what? We have it right here. We do. Spend 3 years in this book. Chew it up every day. Every day. Spend time in it. A couple hours a day. Chew it up. Make this a priority. Let me ask you this. If you make this a priority, if Christ becomes the priority in your life, getting to know who he really is, not just familiar with him, but you have that saving faith without a doubt that if you died today, you're in his presence and you're thankful for his gift. No doubt. How would that affect you? Well, I can tell you it would change your life. It would change every aspect of you. Everything you believed, everything that you counted on would go away. Christ would be your focus. He would be your all in all. That would show the world that you know who Christ is. Because you're dependent on nothing else. Nothing else matters. Everything around us is going to fade away. All of it. Even your Dodge truck. I know that's hard to say. But it's all going to go. The only thing that's going to be left at the end of the world is Christ. And Christ alone. So where are we going to be? Are we going to pour into this? Are we going to transform ourselves into truth? Because that's what we're talking about. We've been formed and manipulated by a broken world for years. Now we need to pour into God's truth to let him transform us into the truth so that we are truly a reflection of him, not just some mediocre image that has no desire. As a matter of fact, what do we know about lukewarm, right? That's what, lukewarm, that's disgusting. I'd rather deal with a lost person than a lukewarm Christian. It's pathetic. That's why Jesus spit it out. Be hot or be cold. Get to know Jesus. And he will transform you. And guess what? Yes, that's a miracle, but that's not the big miracle. Get to know Jesus and let him transform you. And guess what? The people around you will be transformed as well. And that's his plan. For you to love him and trust him so much that you become infectious to the people around you. Not repulsive. Not a hypocrite. Because we like to think we put on this mask when we go out here and we're the super Christian, and the world sees right through it. Right? As Christians, we struggle with the same things. Look at the statistics. We struggle with divorce, pornography, and everything else in the world. Why? Because we're familiar with Jesus. We don't know him. We like the idea. But to know him means that I have to surrender all the baggage and junk that I carry around that I think is so cool to him. And what does he see? All the things that are important to me as filthy rags. Everything that I think is great is nothing but a filthy rag to God. It's kind of depressing. But it shows you where we need to be, what we need to be thinking about. So there's the promise this morning. Pour into Christ. Search for him. Get to know him and let him transform you. And he will transform the lives around you. And that is a promise. Let's pray.